Chapter 1. Birth of a Thinker. Pisa, 1564. The Bell of Pisa. The bells of Pisa tolled on the 15th of February, 1564, as a baby boy entered the world within the walls of an ancient Tuscan city. The child was named Galileo Galilei, son of Vincenzo Galilei, a musician and musical theorist, and Giulia Ammannati, a devout mother from a respected Florentine family. Few could have imagined that this child, born in the shadow of the Leaning Tower, would one day tilt the axis of science itself. In the 16th century, Italy was a patchwork of city-states, where the church reigned supreme, and the ancient philosophies of Aristotle defined the limits of thought. To challenge either was to risk ruin. But from the start, Galileo's life would be one of subtle resistance first, to tradition, then to authority, and finally to ignorance. A household of harmony and tension, Galileo's father, Vincenzo, was no ordinary musician. A thinker in his own right, he challenged established musical theories, insisting that sound followed mathematical laws, not arbitrary rules handed down by authority. This spirit of skepticism and inquiry flowed through the Galilei household like a secret current. Young Galileo grew up amid music, mathematics, and the smell of ink. Though his family was not wealthy, they valued knowledge above all. Vincenzo taught his son to read, write, and think critically. More importantly, he taught him not to accept anything simply because it had always been believed. Early curiosity. Galileo showed signs of brilliance from an early age. He would spend hours tinkering with mechanical toys, building simple pulleys and gears from household items. He watched water pour from jugs and imagined invisible forces guiding its path. Even as a child, he was fascinated by motion, gravity, and the mysteries of the natural world. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, of young Galileo watching a lamp swing from a chain in the Pisa Cathedral. He noticed that no matter how wide or narrow the arc of its swing, the time it took remained constant. This observation would later lead to the concept of the isochronous pendulum, foundational idea in the development of timekeeping. Florence and the first taste of books. When the family moved to Florence in 1574, Galileo was introduced to a broader intellectual world. Florence was the cradle of the Renaissance, home to artists, philosophers, and astronomers. The works of Leonardo da Vinci still whispered from old sketches, and the dome of Brunelleschi loomed overhead like a symbol of human triumph. Here, Galileo encountered Euclid's Elements, the geometric treatise that had shaped mathematics for 2 millennia. The logic and structure of geometry captivated him. For the first time, he saw a system of knowledge built not on authority, but on proof. It was a revelation. Pisa and the path of medicine. In 1581, at the age of 17, Galileo was sent to the University of Pisa to study medicine, as his father hoped he would become a doctor and secure the family's future. But Galileo was bored by lectures on Galen and Hippocrates, the ancient physicians whose theories remained unquestioned for centuries. One day, he stumbled into a mathematics lecture by chance. The elegance of numbers, the logic of proportion, the power of mathematical reasoning it struck him like lightning. He begged his father to let him switch his focus to mathematics and philosophy. At first, Vincenzo refused. There was no money in mathematics. But eventually, perhaps recognizing his own rebellious spirit in his son, he relented. The beginning of a scientific mind. Galileo immersed himself in the study of geometry, astronomy, and physics. He read the works of Archimedes, the ancient Greek who used logic and mathematics to understand levers, buoyancy, and mechanics. Archimedes became Galileo's hero, and he modeled his own thinking after the great Sicilian. Soon, Galileo was writing treatises of his nearly essays on hydrostatics and motion. He challenged the Aristotelian idea that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. Through experimentation and observation, he began to realize that experience was a better teacher than dogma. This was a dangerous idea, the clash of worlds. In the 16th century, the dominant worldview was still based on Aristotle and Ptolemy, whose teachings were deeply embedded in both academic institutions and church doctrine. According to Aristotle, the earth was at the center of the universe. The heavens were perfect and unchanging. Motion required constant force. All of this was taught as absolute truth. Galileo, however, began to see the cracks in these ancient foundations. He understood that observation, measurement, and reason could lead to new truths that defied tradition. In this age of intellectual conformity, such thoughts were not just revolutionary, they were dangerous. From student to teacher, by 1589, Galileo had earned a teaching position at the University of Pisa. There, he began conducting public demonstrations that undermined Aristotelian physics. In one famous display, he dropped 2 spheres of different masses from the Leaning Tower of Pisa to show that they landed at the same time, a bold rejection of Aristotle's claim that heavier objects fall faster. His students were intrigued. His colleagues were scandalized. Though he was admired by some for his brilliance and theatrical teaching style, others saw him as a threat. Eventually, his growing reputation as a heretic in the making cost him his position. But the seeds of revolution had already been planted. The road to Padua. Galileo soon found a new post at the University of Padua in the Republic of Venice. Here, away from the prying eyes of the Tuscan church, Galileo thrived. He taught geometry, astronomy, and mechanics. He designed military instruments, studied fortifications, and built thermometers and compasses. But it was in Padua that he would make his most world-shattering discovery, a new window to the cosmos. Chapter 2, The Awakening of the Heavens, How Galileo's Telescope Changed the Universe. A New Age of Eyes. In the early 17th century, whispers traveled through Europe of a strange device being used in the Netherlands zone that could make distant objects appear near. A spyglass, they called it. Merchants used it to spot incoming ships before their competitors. Soldiers to see advancing enemies from afar. But in the hands of Galileo Galilei, this curious invention would become something else entirely, a tool for revelation. In 1609, upon hearing of the Dutch invention, Galileo did not wait for a shipment. He built his own. From glass to revelation. Using knowledge of lenses and geometry, Galileo constructed a telescope with a magnification of about 3x. Not satisfied, he improved it first to 8x, then 20x. Unlike the Dutch tool used merely for navigation, Galileo aimed his creation skyward. For the first time in human history, someone would see the heavens not with wonder alone, but with scrutiny. When he looked through his telescope, the universe that had stood still for 2,000 years came alive. The moon, not a perfect sphere. Galileo's first major revelation came with the moon. Aristotle had taught that all celestial bodies were perfect, spheresmooth, unblemished, divine, but what Galileo saw shook that belief to its core. The moon's surface was rough and cratered, with mountains and valleys casting shadows. He sketched what he saw in meticulous detail. This was not the pristine firmament described by the ancients. It was real, textured, and familiar. The heavens, it seemed, were made of the same material as the earth, the Milky Way and countless stars. Turning his telescope toward the Milky Way, Galileo was awestruck. What appeared to the naked eye as a faint band of light resolved into countless stars too many to number. It was not a cloud or a celestial mist. It was a galaxy of light composed of stars, just like our own Sunday. This revelation expanded the universe. The cosmos was no longer small and comprehensible. It was vast, infinite, and filled with unknowns. The moons of Jupiter. Then came a discovery that would destroy the Ptolemaic model once and for all. On the 7th of January, 1610, Galileo observed 3 tiny stars near Jupiter. They were aligned and moved oddly. Night after night, he tracked them. A 4th star appeared. And then, shockingly, the 4 points of light orbited Jupiter. These were the Galilean Munzio, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. If moons could orbit another planet, then not all celestial bodies revolved around the Earth. The Aristotelian and Ptolemaic models crumbled before his eyes. Galileo had proof that the Earth was not the center of all motion. Sidereus Nuncius, the starry messenger. Galileo knew his findings would provoke outrage, and yet he also knew the world must hear them. In March 1610, he published his observations in Sidereus Nuncius, the starry messenger. The slim volume caused a sensation. In it, he described the moon's mountains, the vast number of stars, and most controversially, the moons of Jupiter. He dedicated the work to Cosimo II de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and named the moons of Jupiter the Medicean stars in his Honora political move to secure patronage and protection. It worked. Galileo was invited to return to Florence as chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke. But in doing so, he stepped closer to the dangerous heart of power, the Roman Catholic Church, public triumph and private dissent. Galileo became a celebrity. Nobles, scholars, and even princes requested demonstrations of his telescope. His ideas gained traction, but also enemies. Many academics refused to look through his instrument, claiming that the telescope was trickery or that its revelations contradicted Scripture. At a banquet in Florence, one court philosopher declared that Jupiter's moons could not exist because Aristotle had not mentioned them. Galileo, incredulous, realized that facts alone would not win this war. He was not merely fighting error, he was challenging a worldview one that placed Earth at the center of God's creation, supported by Scripture and enforced by the Church. Confronting the heavens with Scripture, the most pressing opposition came from theologians. The Bible spoke of the sun standing still, of the firmament above. To say that the earth movator, that the heavens were not perfect, was not just scientific heresy, it was religious heresy. Galileo tried to tread carefully. He argued that Scripture was not meant to teach astronomy and that the Bible's descriptions were written in the language of common understanding. The intention of the Holy Spirit is to teach us how one goes to heaven, not how heaven goes, he wrote. But to many, this was dangerous reasoning. Support from a future pope. Galileo found some allies among the educated clergy. One such supporter was Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, a man of letters and science, who would later become Pope Urban VIII. Barberini praised Galileo's work and believed that the Copernican model could be discussed hypothetically. With this support, Galileo felt emboldened. He continued his lectures, correspondence, and public writings, slowly building a case for heliocentrism, the model of the solar system in which the sun stood at the center and the earth moved around it. Still, he knew he was walking a dangerous line. The clash with Simplicio. In 1616, the Catholic Church issued a decree. The heliocentric model was formally heretical. Galileo was summoned to Rome and warned not to teach or defend Copernican theory. He obeyed outwardly. For nearly a decade, Galileo remained silent on the matter. But when his friend Barberini ascended to the papacy in 1623 as Pope Urban VIII, Galileo believed the time had come to speak again. He sought and received permission to write about heliocentrism so long as it was treated hypothetically. The result was Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, published in 1632. In the book, 3 characters debate the geocentric and heliocentric models. The defender of the old ways, named Simplicio, the simpleton, was portrayed as foolish and rigidly similar, many thought, to the Pope himself. Galileo's enemy pounced. The trap is set. The church, feeling mocked and threatened, turned against Galileo. The Inquisition accused him of violating the 1616 order of promoting heresy under the guise of dialogue. In 1633, he was tried in Rome, forced to recant, and sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. And yet it moves? Galileo is said to have muttered under his breath as he denied the truth he had proven. Chapter 3. Dialogue and Inquisition, the Trial of Reason. The book that shook the earth. In 1632, Galileo released what would become the most controversial and consequential work of his career, Dialogo sopra I due massimi sistemi del mondo, dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. It was framed as a civil conversation between three men. Salviati, the voice of reason and Galileo's own perspective, defended the heliocentric model. Sagredo, an intelligent layman, represented the curious but cautious public. Simplicio, a clumsy Aristotelian, argued for the geocentric model. To many, Simplicio was a thinly veiled caricature of Pope Urban VIII. Though Galileo insisted otherwise, the insult was taken personally. The book was a masterstroke of science, philosophy, and rhetorical power, but it also sparked a political firestorm, the summons to Rome. Shortly after its publication, the book was placed under scrutiny. Galileo, now aged and ailing, was summoned to Rome by the Roman Inquisition. Despite his deteriorating health and his personal friendship with the Pope, there would be no leniency this time. The Pope had turned cold. What began as a scientific dispute had now evolved into a power struggle between truth and authority. The Inquisition begins. In April 1633, Galileo stood before the Holy Office of the Inquisition. The grand halls of the Vatican were not just centers of faith, they were courts of control, where theology and power were inseparable. Galileo was charged with suspicion of heresy, violating the 1616 edict forbidding the promotion of Copernican ideas, mocking the Pope through the character Simplicio. The interrogators were not merely interested in facts, they wanted submission. They demanded Galileo confess that he had erred not only in science, but in faith. The choice, truth or life. Galileo now faced a terrifying dilemma: to stand by the truth and be destroyed, or to deny what he knew and live. He had seen others burn. Giordano Bruno, who supported heliocentrism and other heretical views, had been executed in 1600. The message was clear. On the 22nd of June, 1633, Galileo, broken by pressure, recanted. He read aloud a carefully crafted confession, denying that he had ever believed the earth moved. But in the shadows of that courtroom, legend claims he whispered, "I per si muove," and yet it moves. The sentence: Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy and sentenced to formal imprisonment. However, due to his age and connections, the sentence was commuted to house arrest. He was banned from teaching, publishing, or discussing heliocentrism. His books were placed on the Index of Forbidden Books. Galileo returned to his villa in Arcetri near Florence under permanent surveillance. There, with failing eyesight and damaged spirit, he entered what many believed would be his final chapter, Science in Captivity. Despite the chains of house arrest, Galileo's mind remained free. Isolated from society, he turned inward, focusing not on the stars, but on the laws of motion, matter, and mechanics. His last great work, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences, was completed in secret and smuggled to Holland beyond the Church's reach. Published in 1638, it laid the groundwork for what would become Newtonian physics. In it, Galileo described the principle of inertia, the parabolic path of projectiles, the law of falling bodies. This book would become the bridge between ancient mechanics and modern physics. The price of genius. Galileo spent his final years blind, infirm, and silenced. His beloved daughter, Sister Maria Celeste, a cloistered nun, had been his closest confidant, but she passed away in 1634, leaving him emotionally devastated. Yet he never gave up thinking. Until his death in 1642, he continued to correspond with scientists across Europe, planting seeds for a revolution he would never see. Legacy and rebellion. The Church silenced his voice, but not his ideas. The telescope had opened the heavens, and Galileo had taught mankind to see. His willingness to confront authority, to trust observation over doctrine, marked a new dawn in human thought. He was not merely a scientist, was a symbol of reason's triumph over fear. In secret and in exile, he built the very foundations upon which Isaac Newton would later declare, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And one of those giants was Galileo. Chapter 4. The Two New Sciences, the Last Revolution. The quiet rebellion begins. Galileo Galilei, now confined to his villa in Arcetri, lived under the watchful eye of the Church. Every letter he sent, every visitor he received, was monitored. Yet even as his body weakened, his mind remained unshackled. In those long, silent nights of house arrest, Galileo began composing his final masterpiece. It would not be about the heavens those, for now were forbidden, but about the laws that governed the earth itself. The birth of the new sciences. Galileo's last great work would be called Discorsi e dimostrazioni matematiche intorno a due nuove scienze, discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences. Completed in 1638, this book explored the strength of materials, the motion of objects. Though he could not speak of the moving earth or Sunday, Galileo could still unlock the secrets of motion, and in doing so, he created a blueprint for modern physics. The structure of a masterpiece. Like his earlier dialogue, Two New Sciences was written as a conversation between three characters: Salviati, the voice of Galileo; Sagredo, the intelligent layman; Simplicio, the defender of traditional views. But here, the debate was not over cosmology, it was over the mechanics of nature. Through their dialogue, Galileo explored the nature of motion, resistance, acceleration, and force. The principle of inertia. One of the most radical ideas in Two New Sciences was the principle of inertia. An object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. This idea, revolutionary at the time, directly contradicted Aristotelian physics, which claimed that constant force was needed to sustain motion. Galileo's insight would later become the first law of motion in Newton's Principia, the law of falling bodies. Galileo had long challenged the Aristotelian claim that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. In Two New Sciences, he formalized his theory: all objects, in the absence of air resistance, fall at the same rate. The distance fallen is proportional to the square of the time elapsed. This was the beginning of our modern understanding of acceleration. The parabola of projectiles. Turning to artillery and military science, Galileo described how cannonballs and other projectiles move. A projectile's path is a parabola. Its motion is a combination of horizontal inertia and vertical acceleration due to gravity. This insight bridged the gap between terrestrial and celestial mechanics. Strength of materials. Galileo also turned his mind to engineering and architecture. He investigated how the size and shape of beams affect their ability to support weight. He analyzed the breaking points of rods and supports. This made Two New Sciences not just a physics text, but also a manual for builders, centuries ahead of its time. Smuggled to the world. Galileo knew that publishing his work in Italy was impossible, so he arranged for the manuscript to be smuggled to Protestant Holland beyond the reach of Catholic censors. There, in the free cities of the north, Two New Sciences was printed and distributed across Europe. Scientists, mathematicians, and engineers devoured its pages. Galileo, once silenced, now spoke to the future. The echoes of his thought. The ideas in Two New Sciences became the foundation upon which Isaac Newton would build the laws of motion and universal gravitation. Robert Hooke would explore elasticity. Albert Einstein would later recognize Galileo's methods as the birth of modern scientific reasoning. Though blind and in captivity, Galileo's mind had leaped centuries ahead. A final glimpse of genius. In his last years, Galileo received visits from young admirers and students who risked the Church's wrath to sit at the feet of the Master. One such visitor was Evangelista Torricelli, who would later invent the barometer. Galileo's blindness, caused by cataracts and glaucoma, robbed him of the stars but not of vision. Until his final breath in January 1642, he continued to think, to teach, and to inspire. The last words. When Galileo died, the Church forbade a public funeral. He was buried quietly at the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. A simple tomb marked his resting place for a century, until the world finally gave him the honor he deserved. Galileo's true epitaph was not carved in stone. It was written in the laws of science, the methods of inquiry, and the courage to question. Chapter 5. Galileo's Children, the Legacy of a Rebel Mind. The Spark that Ignited a Revolution. Galileo Galilei died on the 8th of January, 1642, in quiet isolation. But his ideas were louder than any decree, and far more enduring than the silence imposed by the Church. His books, once forbidden, traveled across borders, copied by hand, passed in secret, and devoured by minds eager to understand the universe. In Galileo's rebellion against dogma, he had not only redefined science, he had birthed a new way of thinking. Across Europe, young minds who had never met him began to call him their intellectual father. Isaac Newton. The heir of the earth and heavens. In the same year that Galileo died, another genius was born in England, Isaac Newton. Newton would later write, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And the first pair of shoulders he stood upon was Galileo's. Galileo's work in mechanics directly influenced Newton's three laws of motion. The law of inertia, first described by Galileo. The relationship between force, mass, and acceleration, extended from Galileo's falling body studies. The principle of action and reaction, deeply rooted in Galileo's observations. Even Newton's universal law of gravitation owes its conceptual origins to Galileo's bold choice to measure how things fall. The birth of the scientific method. Galileo did more than observe the heavens. He revolutionized how humans approached knowledge itself. Prior to Galileo, truth was drawn from Scripture, tradition, and the authority of the ancients. Galileo rejected this. He believed that truth must be observed. Theories must be tested. Ideas must be measured, not merely memorized. This became the foundation of the scientific method: observation, hypothesis, experimentation, conclusion, which would become the standard across all disciplines of science. Einstein and the echoes of Galileo. Centuries later, Albert Einstein, perhaps the most celebrated scientist of the 20th century, would pay tribute to Galileo, calling him the father of modern physics, indeed of modern science altogether. Einstein saw himself not just as an heir to Newton, but to Galileo's spirit of resistance. When Einstein challenged Newtonian mechanics with his theory of relativity, he followed Galileo's path to question the unquestionable. Where Newton explained how the universe moved, Einstein, like Galileo, asked why. The Church reconsiders. For centuries after Galileo's trial, the Catholic Church kept his books on the index of forbidden books. His ideas were studied but never celebrated. It was not until 1992, more than 350 years after his conviction, that Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged the Church's error and praised Galileo as a man of honest faith and great science. In an address, the Pope said, "Galileo suffered from a tragic conflict between reason and faith. Today we recognize that he was right." Galileo's name was finally restored, though his ideas had never truly been buried. The legacy of the telescope. The telescope, once dismissed as a novelty, is now a symbol of humanity's pursuit of truth. Every satellite, every space probe, every Mars rover, and every image of the cosmos owes a debt to the man who first dared to point a lens skyward. The Hubble Space Telescope, launched in 1990, extended Galileo's vision into the farthest reaches of space. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, peers into the origins of galaxies and stars, fulfilling Galileo's dream of an infinite universe. These modern miracles are not just tools, they are echoes of Galileo's courage. Education and the Galileo Standard. In classrooms across the world, Galileo is taught as more than a historical figure. He is a symbol of curiosity over conformity, of reason over ritual, of evidence over edict. His name appears in textbooks, science competitions, observatories, and even spacecraft. To say Galilean is to invoke precision, bravery, and revolution. Artists, writers, and philosophers inspired. Galileo's legacy is not limited to science. He has inspired Bertolt Brecht, who wrote the play Life of Galileo, highlighting the moral cost of truth. Salvador Dalí, who painted images of Galileo's universe. Carl Sagan, who invoked Galileo's defiance in Cosmos. To many, Galileo is not just a scientist. He is a hero of intellectual freedom. Galileo's true inheritance. The stars he studied still shine. Every time a student drops two balls of different weights and watches them fall equally, they are proving Galileo right. Every time a satellite orbits the Earth, every time an engineer calculates a trajectory, every time a telescope captures a distant galaxy, it is an act of continuing his work. Galileo's true monument is not his tomb in Florence, but the method of thinking he gave to humankind. Chapter 6. The man behind the genius, family, faith, and the final years. A life of intellect, a heart of flesh. For all his brilliance, Galileo Galilei was not merely a mind. He was a man, a father, a son, a believer, and a doubter. His genius lit the skies, but his heart was often burdened by sorrow, by guilt, and by longing for peace. To understand Galileo fully, one must not only study his formulas, but also read his letters, feel his losses, and hear the silence that surrounded him in exile. A complicated fatherhood. Galileo never married, but he fathered 3 children with a woman named Marina Gamba of Venice. Their relationship, though never formalized, lasted many years. Their children, Virginia Galilei, Livia Galilei, Vincenzo Galilei. As a man of science and social standing, Galileo faced a dilemma. His children, born out of wedlock, were considered illegitimate, limiting their futures. He made a painful choice. He placed both daughters in a convent, believing it was the only path for women without dowries. Maria Celeste, the light in his darkness. Virginia, renamed Sister Maria Celeste, took her vows at the San Matteo convent near Florence. Despite the walls between them, she became Galileo's closest emotional companion. Their surviving letters reveal a tender relationship, a shared wit and wisdom, a daughter's unwavering devotion to her exiled father. She sent him food, medicine, prayers, and encouragement through the dark years of house arrest. He sent her science, books, and love. In 1634, Maria Celeste died at just 33 years old, likely from dysentery. Her death shattered Galileo's already fragile spirit. He described her as a soul of the highest order and never emotionally recovered. struggles with faith. Though Galileo's work challenged church doctrine, he was never an atheist. In fact, he once wrote, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use." He saw no conflict between science and faith, only between truth and those who feared it. His conflict was not with God, but with men who refused to see. Yet his excommunication, forced recantation, and public humiliation left scars. He prayed daily, but never again attended public mass. Faith remained in his soul, but trust perhaps did not. The burden of isolation. After his trial, Galileo was allowed to live at Villa il Gioiello, the Jewel, a modest estate in Arcetri, but it was no palace. It was a prison with gardens. His only visitors were carefully monitored. His letters were censored. His movements were forbidden. He suffered from blindness in both eyes by 1638, chronic pain, grief for Maria Celeste, constant surveillance, and yet, amid this isolation, he wrote his most influential book, Two New Sciences Proof that a Mind on Fire Can Burn Through Walls. The final visitors. Despite church restrictions, scientists still came quietly, reverently, at risk of condemnation. One was Evangelista Torricelli, who would go on to invent the barometer. Torricelli became Galileo's assistant, student, and friend in those final years. Their conversations about air pressure, motion, and sound added to the legacy Galileo would leave behind. Other visitors included Protestant scholars from the Netherlands and Englandmen who would carry Galileo's methods across Europe, seeding the scientific revolution. The last months. By late 1641, Galileo's body was failing. His health, already fragile, began to collapse. He was nearly blind, unable to write, and increasingly dependent on assistance. In his final weeks, he dictated reflections, thoughts, and scientific queries to his students. Even as death approached, he was asking questions, not seeking comfort, but discovery. On the 8th of January, 1642, Galileo passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 77. His final breath echoed not in silence, but in the long, thunderous roar of history. A contested burial. Galileo wished to be buried in Santa Croce, among Florence's great minds. His supporters planned a grand tomb beside Michelangelo, but the church denied it. He was buried in a small, unmarked grave in a side chapel. No funeral, no public mourning, a whisper in the dark. And yet, his name was never forgotten. The tomb at last, nearly a century later, in 1737, his remains were moved to a monumental tomb in Santa Croce, where he lies today beneath a statue of himself gazing toward the heavens. Above him, carved in stone, are the tools of his Tridea telescope, a book, a globe. Below, in silence, rests the man who dared to say, "The earth moves." Great! Let's continue with Chapter 7 of the 50,000-word script about Galileo Galilei. This chapter explores how, even after his death, his ideas were hunted, his books banned, and yet his legacy burned brighter with every effort to silence it. Chapter 7. The War on Silence, Banned Books, Hidden Manuscripts, and the Fire That Wouldn't Die. The Index of Forbidden Books. After Galileo's death in 1642, the Church tightened its grip on his legacy. His most controversial works, Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, and Two New Sciences, were placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, Index of Forbidden Books. Possession of these texts could lead to excommunication, imprisonment, or worse. And yet, the more they banned, the more they spread. Secretly printed copies circulated in Protestant countries, Holland, England, and Germany. Scholars whispered his name like a spell. Copies were smuggled in sewn bookbindings, inside wine barrels, or in the coats of traveling scientists. Every attempt to silence him only made him more sought after. Hidden libraries and silent rebels. In Catholic Italy and Spain, Galileo's followers created underground reading circles. They copied pages by hand. Some memorized passages in case the written word had to be burned. At the University of Padua, professors taught mechanics by day and Galilean physics by candlelight at night. In Florence, students passed secret notes under the table questions about inertia, about parabolas, about the moons of Jupiter. His science had become a form of rebellion, the Protestant safe havens. In the Protestant North, the suppression of Galileo's ideas was not enforced. Universities in the Netherlands, Denmark, and England embraced his work openly. There, the telescope was revered. The dialogue was taught freely. His image hung in lecture halls. His method of inquiry became the default approach to knowledge. In Cambridge, students of mathematics pored over two new sciences, which had become the bridge to Newtonian physics. In Leiden, Dutch professors began to merge Galileo's mechanics with Cartesian thought, setting the foundation for a new European scientific identity, one not ruled by Rome, but by reason. The forbidden flame in France. In France, where Catholicism still ruled but intellectual curiosity grew, Galileo's ideas penetrated slowly but deeply. Thinkers like René Descartes, Blaise Pascal, and later Voltaire read and absorbed Galileo's ideas. Many had to do so in secret. The Enlightenment that would eventually sweep through France found one of its earliest sparks in the shadow of Galileo's banned books, the Jesuits' quiet admiration. Even within the church, not everyone opposed him. Some members of the Jesuit order, educated men who prized astronomy and mathematics, quietly admired Galileo's genius. Though they could not publicly defend him, many continued his observations. Some even kept private telescopes and logged the movements of Jupiter's moons, just as Galileo had done. A few brave Jesuit astronomers wrote to their colleagues under pseudonyms, sharing new experiments rooted in Galilean principles, carefully worded to avoid censure. Galileo had created a world too rich to deny, even from within the walls that tried to imprison it. The power of the telescope? One of the most ironic truths was this: the very instrument that led to Galileo's Trialpha telescope had become a global scientific standard. By the mid-17th century, naval expeditions used telescopes to chart coastlines and stars. Clockmakers used them to refine pendulum-based timekeeping, using Galileo's own observation. Observatories were built across Europe and Asia, many following Galilean models. It was as if the world had embraced his eyes, even as it denied his voice. Whispers in America. By the 18th century, even the American colonies, founded by thinkers and religious dissenters, began to read Galileo. Benjamin Franklin would later cite Galileo as a pioneer of practical science, and Thomas Jefferson saw him as a martyr for reason. The seeds Galileo planted in Padua and Arcetri had crossed oceans. The fire that wouldn't die. Every century that followed brought another reckoning. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers called for the reprinting of Galileo's works in full. In the 19th century, scientists like James Clerk, Maxwell, and Michael Faraday paid tribute to Galileo's role in establishing the language of physics. In the 20th century, with the rise of relativity and quantum mechanics, Albert Einstein reminded the world that modern science began with Galileo. The Church, meanwhile, began to re-examine its past. A formal vindication. In 1981, Pope John Paul II commissioned a pontifical commission on Galileo to investigate the Church's historical actions. After 11 years of analysis, the commission concluded that Galileo's judges failed to grasp the distinction between scientific hypothesis and heresy, that the condemnation was an error rooted in the politics and fear of the time. In 1992, before a global audience, the Pope publicly stated, Galileo suffered unjustly at the hands of his accusers. It was not just a personal pardon, it was a cultural confession of guilt. The war on Galileo had ended, but the fire he lit had never gone out. Chapter 8. Galileo and the Future. How One Mind Changed the Destiny of Mankind. The turning point of history. Few individuals in history can truly be said to have altered the course of humanity. Galileo Galilei was one of them. He was not just a man of science, he was a man of transformation. With a telescope, a notebook, and an unbreakable will, Galileo opened the gates to a new world. Order ruled not by fear and authority, but by evidence, inquiry, and logic. He did not merely discover celestial bodies or redefine motion, he helped redesign the human mind. The scientific world he helped create. Before Galileo, truth came from ancient philosophers, religious scripture, political power. After Galileo, truth began to come from observation, mathematics, repeatable experiments. He turned philosophy into science and belief into proof. This intellectual revolution paved the way for Newton's laws of motion, Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, Darwin's theory of evolution, Einstein's theory of relativity. Each of these monumental achievements was built on the foundation Galileo laid. Technology and the Galilean engine. Galileo's ideas didn't just influence textbooks, they became tools. His work led to the development of accurate clocks, thanks to his pendulum studies, improved telescopes, ballistics and military physics, engineering principles for bridges and buildings, satellites and GPS, based on his insights into inertia and motion. From the steam engine to the smartphone, modern technology bears his invisible signature. Galileo and the space age. When Galileo looked at the moons of Jupiter in 1610, he could not have imagined that, centuries later, spacecraft would be named in his honor. In 1989, NASA launched the Galileo space probe to Jupiter. It became the first spacecraft to orbit Jupiter, the first to send a probe into a gas giant's atmosphere, the first to observe volcanic activity on another world, Io. Galileo's name rode through space 400 years after he first glimpsed the very moons the probe would explore. He had been condemned for saying, "Earth moves yet." Now his name moved among the stars, changing the way we think. Perhaps Galileo's most enduring impact lies not in what we discovered, but in how we now discover. He taught us to doubt inherited knowledge, trust evidence over authority, ask questions that make others uncomfortable, accept that truth does not require permission. These values are now so embedded in the scientific method that we forget they were once acts of rebellion. Without Galileo's example, we might still be gazing at the sky with reverence, instead of exploring it with reason. Education in Galileo's shadow. Modern education from primary school to university is built on Galilean principles. Teach students to ask questions, not just memorize answers. Demonstrate ideas through experiments, not lectures alone. Emphasize evidence, logic, and modeling. Every physics lab with inclined planes and pendulums honors his memory. Every textbook on motion carries his fingerprints. His name has been given to universities and science centers, classrooms and satellites, awards and scientific journals. He is not just in the past, is in every experiment we do today. The cultural Galileo. Beyond science, Galileo became a symbol. To artists, he represents bold vision. To poets, he is the man who gave the stars a voice. To philosophers, he is proof that reason must challenge authority. To freedom fighters, he is the thinker who defied an empire. To every student, he is proof that one mind can defy the whole world and win. The moral of the telescope. Galileo did not invent courage, but he gave it form. He taught us that truth is not always comfortable. Belief should never replace evidence. Progress requires sacrifice. He paid with humiliation, isolation and blindness, but in return he gave us the universe. He showed us that the stars were not gods but worlds, waiting to be known. That motion was not mystical but mathematical, that we, insignificant as we are, can still understand everything. A legacy of light. More than 4 centuries have passed since Galileo first raised his telescope to the sky, and yet his vision grows sharper with time. We now land on moons, photograph black holes, search for life beyond our solar system, speak of multiverses and space-time. All of this was made possible by one man in a quiet observatory who dared to say, "What if everything they taught us is wrong?" Chapter 9. Dialogues Reopened. The Revival of Galileo in Modern Science, Culture, and Human Rights. The return of the dialogue. Galileo's dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems, once banned and burned, is now read and taught in universities around the world. It is no longer viewed solely as a scientific text, but as a literary and philosophical masterpiece of play of ideas, written with elegance, irony, and courage. The characters of Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio have become metaphors. Salviati, for bold, uncompromising truth. Sagredo, for the open-minded everyman. Simplicio, for blind allegiance to tradition. This structure mirrors every intellectual struggle of the modern world. Science versus dogma, progress versus control, curiosity versus fear. Galileo in Human Rights Discourse. Today, Galileo's trial is taught not only in physics, but in law schools and ethics seminars. His experience is a case study in the abuse of authority, the dangers of ideological suppression, and the resilience of the human mind. The United Nations has invoked his legacy in discussions on academic freedom, freedom of expression, protection of scientists in authoritarian regimes. Organizations like Amnesty International have referenced Galileo as a historical prisoner of conscience. He is a martyr of knowledge, honored in the same breath as Socrates, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela. Galileo on stage and screen. His life has inspired countless plays, films, and television adaptations. The most famous of them is Life of Galileo by Bertolt Brecht, a powerful theatrical portrayal of Galileo's struggle between truth and survival, written during the rise of fascism in the 20th century. Brecht's Galileo reflects every thinker caught between what must be said and what can be said. Other notable adaptations include Galileo TV Drama 2002, Einstein and Eddington 2008, where Galileo's ghostly influence looms over relativity. Appearances in Cosmos by Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson, both of whom place Galileo at the center of humanity's awakening. The Museum and the Finger. In Florence, the Museo Galileo stands as a tribute to his work. It houses his original telescopes, scientific instruments, manuscripts and drawings, and strangely his middle finger, preserved and on display, raised eternally toward the sky. Some say it also stands as a silent gesture toward the forces that tried to stop him. That finger has become a symbol of rebellion, curiosity, and the sharp point of reason. The Vatican's quiet transformation. Ironically, the same church that condemned Galileo now funds observatories, employs astronomers, and contributes to cosmology. The Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical institutions in the world, now honors the legacy of the man it once silenced. Jesuit scientists today study galaxies, dark matter, and black holes. In a twist of history, Galileo's spirit now watches the stars through the very eyes of the Church. Galileo in the digital age. In the 21st century, Galileo's work has found new life online. Digitized manuscripts, interactive telescope simulations, open-access physics platforms based on Galilean principles, he is referenced in AI ethics, space exploration policies, and open science movements. When tech companies promote thinking differently, they echo the voice of a man who once said, "I have never met a man so ignorant that I couldn't learn something from him." Galilean moments in modern science. When climate scientists defend their data against political denial, they live a Galilean moment. When doctors and researchers challenge misinformation, they echo his method. When students in oppressive regimes study forbidden theories, they follow his path. When journalists uncover uncomfortable truths, they walk in his shadow. Galileo has become more than a man. He is a metaphor for resistance. Lessons in uncertainty. In an age of instant information, Galileo reminds us that knowledge must be earned, not inherited. Doubt is a virtue when guided by evidence. Science is not a doctrinate, is a discipline of humility. He reminds us that we are fallible but capable, ignorant but improving, lost but always searching, reopening the dialogue forever. The dialogue that Galileo wrote was not closed by his recantation. It continues every time someone asks why, builds a better model, challenges a failing system, stands up to power with nothing but logic and courage. We are all characters in Galileo's ongoing conversation between light and darkness, between knowledge and fear, between what is and what is yet to be understood. Chapter 10. The Immortal Mind, Galileo's Final Triumph. The Death That Wasn't. Galileo Galilei died in 1642, but not in any meaningful sense. His body may have ceased, but his voice, his method, and his mind live on. He was condemned by men who feared the stars, and yet today his name rides on spacecraft, is etched into universities, and is whispered in classrooms and laboratories around the world. While those who silenced him have faded into historical obscurity, Galileo has become immortality, conscience of science, and the soul of reason. The true triumph. Galileo's greatest victory was not winning an argument about the structure of the solar system. It was proving that truth need not bow to power. In a world ruled by kings and popes, he showed that a simple lens, a well-kept notebook, and a brave voice could change reality. His triumph was not only in what he saw, but in what he refused to unsee. Even when blind, he saw more clearly than his judges. Even under arrest, he moved the earth. Even in silence, he spoke louder than 1,000 sermons. The Eternal Witness. Galileo's final gift was not a discovery, it was permission. Permission to ask bold questions, doubt familiar answers, challenge invisible walls. He reminded us that the universe does not care about our fear, our myths, or our pride. It simply is waiting to be understood by those willing to look. That is the courage he gave us. Galileo and the future of humanity. As we look toward the 22nd century and beyond, Galileo's relevance only grows. In an age where truth is politicized, science is questioned, facts are often buried beneath belief. Galileo stands as a moral compass, pointing us back to clarity, to method, and to reality. We now face new inquisitions, not of clergy, but of ideology, censorship, and ignorance. The tools may change, but the danger remains the same. Galileo is the whisper in our minds reminding us, measure, observe, think, speak, in the language of stars. Modern astronomy has given us new ways to think about time and space. Stars, billions of light years away, shine light that began traveling before Galileo was born. That light enters our telescope's descendants of the one Galileo first lifted to the heavens. In those beams of starlight are the answers to his unasked questions. He never saw black holes. He never heard of exoplanets or quantum fields. He died long before relativity, dark energy, or the Big Bang. And yet, Every one of those discoveries bears his fingerprints. Final reflections. The man and the mirror. In many ways, Galileo held up a mirror to humanity. He forced us to see that we are not the center of the universe. The cosmos is vast and uncaring. Our knowledge is always incomplete, but in doing so, he made us stronger. He made us freer. He made us wiser. He replaced comforting illusions with thrilling possibilities. In the face of infinity, he taught us to be humble but not small. The voice of the cosmos. Carl Sagan once wrote, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." Galileo was the first whisper of that truth the moment the universe began to hear its own voice through the human mind. Through his eyes, the stars became close. Through his courage, the earth became a planet. Through his defiance, the mind became free. A final image. Picture him now not as a prisoner, not as a heretic, not as a man growing blind, but as a figure of light at the edge of a telescope, smiling as a child looks up and sees the moon for the first time. His bones may rest in Florence, but his soul walks among the stars. And each time someone dares to ask, what is true? Galileo Galilei lives again. Epilogue. And yet it moves. Eppur si muove. And yet it moves. These were the words whispered in defiance, legend says, after Galileo recanted before the church. 4 centuries later, they are more than words. They are a declaration not just of astronomy, but of human dignity, scientific freedom, and the eternal motion of the curious spirit. Galileo taught us that though we may be silenced, though we may be punished, though the night may fall, truth will keep moving. And so will we.